Hello, my name is Dave Lewis, and I am the host of Cinemallennials, a podcast where myself and another millennial watch a classic film that we haven't seen before, ranging from the early 1900s to the late 1960s, and discuss its significance and relevance in our world today. On today's episode, I talked with Aubrey Rieder, who chose 1941's Sullivan's Travels, the comedic romp that isn't just a comedy. Written and directed by wildly ahead of his time playwright, screenwriter, and director Preston Sturges, and starring Joel McCrea, as well as the gorgeously sexy and tough Veronica. Sullivan's Travels follows the story of John L. Sullivan, a multimillionaire director of comedy films like Ants in Your Plants of 1941 and Hey Hey in the Hayloft, who plans to make Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?, an epic that follows the social miseries of the day. When confronted about not having the life experience of those miseries by his producers, Sullivan has a great idea that if he goes full method by dressing up and living amongst the downtrodden and the poor, he'll truly understand the subject of his film. That is, until he arrives back in LA only hours later and discovers a down-on-her-luck but practical actress. And that's where our rollicking adventure begins. So sit back, relax, and don't forget the donuts. Hey Aubrey, welcome to the show. What year were you born? What was the first film you saw in theaters? And what are your favorite films at the moment?
So I was born in 1995. The first movie that I at least remember seeing in theaters, I think, was a Pokemon movie. That's at least the strongest first memory I have as a kid in the movie theaters. And some of my favorite movies are Tommy Boy, The Neverending Story, and The Princess Bride.
I mean, you clearly like comedy, which is great that you picked Sullivan's Travels. Did you have any experiences with classic movies prior to watching the movie?
I've seen, some of the classics that I think most people have seen, Gone with the Wind, stuff like that. I wouldn't call myself a movie connoisseur. I think that I see maybe one movie a month, if that. So I'm kind of picky about my movies. I'm not a gore and guts kind of person. I definitely like things that are lighthearted, but also make me think. So looking at the list and seeing Sullivan's Travels and kind of saying, oh, that reminds me of Gulliver's Travels. That's kind of what drew me to it, because I'm a big lit nerd, and Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels is one of my favorite books. So I was happy to kind of choose something that looked like a satire and a comedy for that.
What were some parallels that you saw within this film that relate back to Gulliver's Travels?
I think probably the biggest parallel is just the idea of the quote unquote better part of society and worst part of society. In Gulliver's Travels, one of the big things is that the 4 different regions he travels to are 4 different voyages. The first one is, so much worse, and as I think he puts it, savage than England is, and then the next one is better, and then the next is worse, and the next is better. So I think that kind of, what could be considered a class issue is something that was really underscored in Sullivan's Travels, since it's this, hotshot movie person who is, traveling around as a homeless person to kind of get a feel of that. So I think that was a really big parallel.
To be honest, I've never read Gulliver's Travels. I only know like vaguely the plots and, the whole self-discovery of Gulliver himself. And I think it was really cool to see that there were some parallels within that, and how within this film it's intellectual, but it's also like really hilarious at the same time.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like I was like with most of these movies, like how you said Tommy Boy and things like that. I mean, you can definitely see some connection to that film within the pratfalls, within the physical comedy, because that kind of comedy is timeless, and that's actually like something that I enjoy more of, like rather than things that are, coming out now. This can work in like any period really, because again, another thing that's timeless is the whole classicist type of ideas where, middle class versus upper class, and it's super relevant to what's happening today. Like, it's kind of funny how Sullivan is talking to these executive producers, and they're like, "Oh, see, it's a commentary on how capitalism and labor, they destroy each other." And I thought that was like, wow, it's like, okay, this is just very clearly applicable to what's going on right now in our society. And like with that, it just amazing how it is still so applicable because those issues never stop.
And what I found really interesting about it, especially the way it applies to today, is, the kind of the point of the movie is this: Sullivan wants to write a movie based on "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou," which is a fake book. I think it was Sinclair Beckstein was the person who wrote it, which is a mix between Upton Sinclair, Sinclair Lewis, and John Steinbeck, all three writers who wrote about the sad parts of society and kind of had commentary on society and the suffering of humanity, which is kind of the opposite of what Jonathan Swift did. He still had a commentary, but it was always going to be satire and comedic. The whole point was for you to laugh about it. And, I thought that kind of the way the homelessness was portrayed was very obviously a caricature of the poor that the rich, like Sullivan, had in their brains. They didn't know what the poor were really like. And I'm sure we'll touch on the girl later, but she was poor, but she didn't look poor. She didn't fit the same mold as everyone else. But then, the way that they were kind of commodifying the homelessness reminds me of, if you see on Instagram different influencers who go on mission trips and they talk about how it changed their lives. They just take a picture with starving children and then they go immediately and post it. They don't really care about the change. They just wanted to experience it to say they did. But I think that we can see the change in Sullivan as he realizes, I don't need to write about the suffering. These people don't want to see any more suffering than they have. They want to laugh.
You're hitting the nail on the head. It's so amazing how we still see this today, where recently the rich have been such a, the rich has been, quote unquote, has been such a out of touch, out of complete, awareness with what's going on in the world. I mean, look at our president. But we have things where it just completely, like, how do you not, like, empathize, and how do you not see these people suffering? Like, they don't need another reminder of their suffering. They need to, they're trying to escape from that. Talking about the rich, it's in a way a film about movie making in Hollywood in 1930s and 40s. And, growing up, like, we were always told how glamorous it was, and never really told until we got older about, the seedy side and how there were major cover-ups of, different crazy things that were happening within these actors. We always thought they were so pure. With this film, do you feel like the perceptions of those things, like the things that you had of the period, like growing up, were kind of taken away, or were there more cheerier depictions?
Yeah, I think that my perceptions were a little torn down because of how self-aware the film was. Sullivan is writing a film about the poor for the rich. That was pretty much what he was doing. He wanted to write about the sad stuff, and the people who are basically the subject of the film weren't the audience. And I think, to me, I just kind of always assumed that old Hollywood glamour was, it was written for the rich. It wasn't really, they didn't care that the poor couldn't relate. And the fact that this movie was so aware of that and kind of pointed that out, I thought was really interesting. And I never really thought about film in the 1940s even being like that. And there were a lot of things in there that I think were unexpected, like the whole fact that Sullivan and the girl sleep in the train car together. And back then, you couldn't be sleeping in the same bed, but they got away with it. Oh, they're not sleeping in the same bed. They're sleeping in a train car together. And the fact that Sturges kind of knew what was, the norm and totally flipped it on its head.
I mean, he's such a brilliant writer, and a lot of people at the time were kind of criticizing this film because they were like, oh, it's not the same kind of, homely feel, like hometown type of film that he had in his past. And it's like kind of this hometown kind of Frank Capra thing. And he even said that, like, when the first, first 5 minutes or whatever the film, they're talking about Frank Capra and like you have to make a picture like Frank Capra, and how because he was such a massive appeal to a wider audience. And that's like, I mean, but at the same time, Frank Capra was able to, go into the nitty gritty of things. I mean, look, It's a Wonderful Life, and how it talks about mental health, how it talks about the depression, and so many different things that it goes into. And I mean, I could talk forever about the movie. I can't wait for somebody to pick that movie, that's for sure. But no, I think Sturgis was, he was seeing these things and he was like, no, I have to, a little bit change these kind of perceptions. And it's kind of funny how we always see Hollywood as this glitz and glamour and this great kind of beauty and things like that. And when on the inside, there was a lot of underbelly, there was a lot of bad things that were happening. And it's interesting because, I mean, when you look at films about Hollywood and about people making it into Hollywood, when you look at A Star Is Born, like especially the early one, the very first one, which came out in the 30s, it's like, oh, we want to aspire to these great heights. And like they think it's this very rich and lavish society that's going to fulfill your life. But when you look at it, I mean, when you look at, the celebrities and the people behind the camera and the people that were in front of the cameras, actual personal lives, they were not too much different than what we see today.
And I think even the girl in the first scene we meet her kind of brings up one of those points, is she's talking about, if you were a big time movie hotshot, I would have to laugh at your jokes. But because you're just a homeless guy, I don't have to laugh. And so that piece of dramatic irony was so perfect, because it highlights the fact that was such an elitist group. And
Right.
the things that women had to do and still have to do today, as we see with a lot of the things that have been coming out about some, Harvey Weinstein, for example, coming out in recent years. She did a really good job of kind of highlighting that seedy part of Hollywood and what's happening. And I didn't feel like Hollywood was actually that romanticized at all. I didn't think that this was the story of this great, wonderful writer and this beautiful woman he meets, and then, it ends happily, which I think is probably the only thing I'm upset that didn't match Gulliver's Travels, but I'm not surprised. It's a movie based very, very, very loosely on a book. The fact that there's a happy ending isn't something that completely shocked me, but their relationship, I think, was really interesting, because they fell for each other, not because of the money and the glamour and everything that Hollywood has to do, kind of the way his wife did. What did he call her? Something like a panther woman, I think was the word he used to describe her. So it was a different relationship, and I really liked seeing that dynamic.
Yeah, and it was really like, it was very refreshing, because it's like she does like kind of fall for him to a certain degree, like very quickly, but like it's because of their experiences and it's because of what they've done together, and she sees him for who he is. Like she's understanding what he wants to do, and she knows what his heart is, and it's a good heart, despite him being a little bit like, oh, I want to be experienced in the poor, like commoditizing it, like you said. So I think where he comes from is a very pure place to a certain degree. When the executive producers are trying to like shame him, like, oh, I was selling papers on the corner over there. Like when I was a kid, I was making $25 like whatever a week. He's like, oh, where'd you go to school? Oh, I was in boarding school. And like, they were trying to do that, and then they twist it on its head, and it's like, oh no, I wasn't doing that at all. Like I lied, and you lied too. It was very funny, and it was funny that you say about the ending, because do you feel like it's satisfying enough, or did you not feel satisfied with it?
I think I'm a little biased, because I went in really hoping to see an ending similar to that of Gulliver's Travels. So, spoiler, Gulliver's Travels, kind of the end, he goes and sees this group of horse people. It sounds weird, and it is weird. He's with this group of horse people, and they basically use humans as their labor. And these hyper intelligent horse people kind of take Gulliver under their wing and teach him a lot, and then he considers himself so superior to the humans, which they are called yahoos in this group, that when he finally gets back to England, he is a complete hermit, because he believes he is way too superior to the humans to have anything to do with them. So part of me the whole time was thinking, is he going to think that he's now too cool for all of these rich Hollywood people?
Mm-hmm.
But it kind of all ended up being back to normal. Like
Right.
there was some change. The biggest character change for him was he realized that he doesn't have to make a commodity out of homelessness. He
Mm-hmm.
can just make people laugh. That's what helps people the most. And he definitely
Right.
gained an understanding of what it's like for those less fortunate.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't think that was necessarily a shocking growth of character. I wasn't very surprised, but I definitely wanted a little bit more. But again, it's a movie, and it's a 90-minute movie, and the satisfying end for the audience is going to be something happy. I think that if it would have been unfortunate if this movie about making people laugh is kind of the key, didn't
Mm-hmm.
make me laugh, or the ending was sad, that would defeat the whole purpose. I was a little disappointed, but I totally understand how it went. If it was a sad ending, it would totally go against the whole one of the lessons film.
Right. I totally agree with you there. Like, I feel, because I kind of felt, I was like, oh, wait. Like, I mean, the film is it feels very short. And I think that, like, I was like, oh, wait, that's it? Like, I wanted a little bit more. But I see what you're saying, and I think it's completely valid that it's, like, kind of, you need to have a happy ending here. Otherwise, people aren't going to be happy with the film. And to be honest, I mean, when this film first came out, it wasn't that, well praised. It wasn't very well praised at all. And only years later, which a lot of these films, a lot of the big major films don't get really famous or they're not considered as masterpieces until way later. It's really interesting how we can see these films from their lens, but also from our lens now, and to see how brilliant they are.
Yeah, I can definitely see how the contemporary audience may not have loved Sullivan's Travels.
Mm.
But I think that's kind of one of the great things about satire is that you don't really have to like it. I'm going back to Jonathan Swift, who, writer of Gulliver's Travels. I'm not sure if you're familiar with A Modest Proposal.
A little bit.
Yeah, so, this essay, to keep a long story short, was written and distributed as basically a call to action saying, hey, the English should eat Irish babies because, the Irish can't afford to feed their babies and they have too many of them. And, oh, look, it's a new delicacy for the British. And people took it seriously. They hated it. They were outraged. Yep. And the whole point of it was to point out, do you see how the British are treating the Irish? This is not good. We can't keep up with this. And
I know exactly what you're talking about now. Now I remember this.
Yeah. So, that's the kind of the beauty of the satire is that when you're in the moment of it, it's easy to get outraged, especially if it's kind of pointing at you. And, the people who probably went and saw movies in the 40s all the time were the people who were movie critics. It was kind of partially criticizing them and just like the overall way Hollywood works.
Right.
So, and again, I think I wrote a quote down. It was the morbid rich find it, as in homelessness and being poor, glamorous.
It's kind of funny you say that. Like, what's the whole thing, like the big theme in fashion, hipster culture and things like that? It's like to look like you're a newsie from the 20th century, right? Like, it's like, oh, let's make it like fashionable to look like destitute and poor. And it's kind of, what you just said. It's like the rich want to be poor and the poor want to be rich. It's like kind of this interchangeable thing throughout history and throughout our society today. And it's kind of like, why can't we just be human? Why can't we just, again, like look at what Sullivan realizes, that it's about making people laugh, and it's about bringing those people out of those depths of the darkness that they're facing and into a light of humor, and reminding us that people are going through a lot of things all at the same time. You don't have to know what they're going through, but if you're able to make them laugh and able to make them see that little ray of hope within that laughter, things could get better.
Mm-hmm. And, I think it's a really important message. I think, I hope that no one who watches it takes it a little too seriously and thinks, oh, let's say Jeff Bezos watches this film and thinks, oh, I can help the poor by making them laugh. And it's like, well, you in your case could probably give a little bit of money. So, I hope that some people don't take it too seriously. But I think the overall message of we don't need to, kind of as you said, currently it's cool to look destitute. It's cool to have my family. Some people would be like, oh, holes in your jeans. Like, it's cool to look that way. And yeah, you know what it is. But also at the same time, the people who actually look that way, it's like that wasn't a trend for them. Or,
right.
This has kind of been bleeding into the racial discussion I want to have about this movie. For a lot of people in the Black community, they felt that speaking in the African American vernacular English, the AAVE, that wasn't cool until suddenly it became trendy and popular just to use certain slang. And it was white people get applauded for it, but Black people get put down and because they're quote unquote stupid. So it's kind of the same thing that the rich or those who are not oppressed take on what the oppressed have because they think it's cool and hip. And I think that's something that has been going on kind of forever. It's always been cool if you were rich to pretend you were poor because it's like, oh, I don't care too much. Or it was always cool to pretend you were like those who were oppressed. And I think that this film, watching it was at a good time because with everything going on with social media, that is kind of the trend, is to appropriate culture that doesn't belong to you. And this kind of points out how that can be problematic.
Right. And I mean, when you're talking about the whole racial issues and when you're talking about this whole kind of trend, it's actually really interesting because, I mean, there's there's one major Black character in this film, and that's the pastor, which I love that scene. I thought that scene was so well done cinematography wise. That part is super influenced by the 1920s and influenced by silent film, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But the head of the NAACP at the time wrote to Sturges praising him for his depiction of Black culture and Black people. So it's really interesting when we're looking at that. There is a scene at the very beginning when they're having the whole car chase scene, which is hilarious. But they have, it's so funny. It's like, I mean, if you don't believe us that this movie's funny, please watch it because it's hilarious. But there is a scene where the Black actor who's the cook, the kind of white frosting or whatever goes into his face, and that's kind of something there too. But I mean, I think when I saw that church scene, I was like, wow, this is very surprising for this time period, because obviously for this time period you still had Jim Crow, you still had a whole bunch of racial issues and lynchings and things like that our history books don't talk about too much. But it's still interesting to see that Sturges was talking about that kind of character and wanted to show them in a better light than others at that time.
Yeah, that's actually exactly what I wanted to say was, I was skeptical. I'm looking at my notes when I saw, I think the character was credited as the colored chef. And when I saw that character, I was like, oh man, like this, I was hoping that there would be something, about race that I could say was redeeming. But then that church scene I thought was so powerful.
Yeah.
It was not, there's a lot of media today that I think kind of makes fun of a lot of the like African American gospel groups. And so when I saw that they were in a church, I was like, oh man, this is going to be some thing poking fun at, these Black Christian people who were just sitting here minding their own business, not doing anything. And they ended up being the most generous people in the whole movie. The nicest characters for sure. And I was so surprised to see, Black Americans portrayed that way in 1941. I was very shocked, but pleasantly surprised.
Yeah, same here. And it's really, I mean, the way that they shot it, the way that the people were just so, like you said, generous and kind to these prisoners. And it's really like a whole thing about, I think about Christianity a lot and how people see it today, and especially within our world and politics and everything. And, that was closer to what Jesus, says in the Bible about, treating the poor and the downtrodden and things like that. And I thought that scene was just probably one of the clearest and more powerful parts of the film, like you said. It was a clarion bell for this kind of film, especially when you have so many changes in tone throughout the movie. What did you think about those changes in tone? Are you starting a new podcast and unsure of where you should host it? Well, fear no further. Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. It's completely free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer, as I'm doing right now. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it could be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever other podcasts are consumed. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Do you think that people within our generation and younger would understand those tones and understand the tonal shifts within genres that they had within this movie?
I honestly think, and I'm extremely optimistic about our young people, but I think young people, those in our generation and younger, could really appreciate this film and would understand it. They may not know the actual meaning. I think it's easy. You could watch this film and not have ever heard of Gulliver's Travels, and you could take away, similar things that I'm taking away. I think they would, yes, understand and really appreciate a lot of the changes in tone and understand some of the historical context, as long as they knew, early 1940s, that's World War II. But I think, I fear that people would be quick to criticize this because not exactly PC, but for the time, it is revolutionary. It was so different. So I think as long as there's that context there, that's, important to keep in mind. I mean, one thing is how important of characters are women in this. We don't even have a name for our female lead, the girl.
How do you feel about that?
I actually think that is also another interesting thing that I'm not sure if Sturges did this on purpose, but, when it comes to casting classic Hollywood films, it was always the same. It was always the same kind of lead role, and Veronica Lake fits that role. But the character didn't matter. It wasn't, we want this femme fatale or this strong, independent woman. It was always, we need someone to play the girl. She wasn't the important part. It was just that we need a female lead to seduce or be the romantic partner of. Yes, they said it. I think they kept saying with a little sex in it. And I think the fact that they didn't give her a name plays that up a little bit, but she was a very dynamic, interesting character. I didn't find her boring. I did a little research afterwards about Veronica Lake, and I mean, super tragic story, this poor woman. But I thought that the character of the girl was a really interesting character, and I think the fact that she went unnamed was a very subtle yet important way to show how women were in Hollywood at the time.
You're taking all of the words that I want to say out of my mouth. It's amazing. Really, though, I thought she was such a cool character. I thought, the whole idea of, when I did see the girl, I was like, oh, that's an interesting kind of take on, to name her the girl. It's all right, it doesn't matter, but at the same time, he's, showing it. This is how Hollywood sees women. And he is just, Sturges, I was watching a couple documentaries and video essays, and they have a video essay on the film on the Criterion Collection, stuff that I watched. Criterion Channel is great. I'm definitely not trying to get a sponsorship by Criterion Channel, not one bit. But there was one that I really enjoyed, and it brought a lot of, interesting points where it's again, what you have to do is with these films and with any classic film, you have to talk about, like, I mean, especially with what you said earlier, is you saw Gone with the Wind, and I'm sure you knew the historical context of that film. And what you have to understand about watching these movies is that, and I mean, recently with Gone with the Wind, with the Looney Tunes, things that always comes up is that there is always some sort of historical significance with these films, but we also have to know why they are historically significant. At the same time as that, we have to know why they are also poor depictions of a lot of different groups of people and a lot of, things that were okay, quote unquote, back then, and why they're not okay now.
And yeah, it's important to criticize this and to criticize the way things were portrayed in the past, but that doesn't mean you need to write it off. The whole idea of history repeats itself if you don't learn about it. That's the same thing here. We see something as an opportunity to change.
Right.
And I think this film highlights that. It's certainly not completely faultless. Again, the chef who is African American, I think that character was a little tasteless. But again,
yes,
1940s, and I think it's important to kind of point out that that's what was okay at the time, and then say, okay, this is why it's not okay now.
It's really crazy how, especially in our day, and how what we see and how history, with Watchmen and how great that show was, and how it's bringing back a lot of conversation about history we don't know. Like, I mean, to be honest, for the majority of the people that I know that watched it didn't know about the Tulsa race riots, and I didn't either, to be fair. And I love history. I mean, most of my stuff is based around history, what I do. So it's massively important that we look at these films and know those things, but, don't write it off, like you said, because they do make a massive impact on what our society is seeing and doing today. So when we're speaking about these different issues in society, and there's a lot of things within this film that talk about different issues in society, what did you think of that whole section of the film that was just basically montage, where they're trying to go from LA to Kansas City, where we're just seeing all the things that they're going through, and we're seeing into the experience of those people, like hobos, tramps, whatever you want to say, homeless people. We were seeing that. What did you think about that? Did you feel like that was a good use of montage? Because we're always used to seeing, like, with our generation, we're used to seeing montage as a way of using it as training sequence or things like that.
I guess I have mixed feelings about it. Yeah, I wish that we got to focus on some of that stuff a little bit more. I think there were times where we were pulled out of the experience of Sullivan and the girl as they were going around as these quote unquote tramps. I think that some of it was just deep enough, but could have been pushed a lot more. And I think the montage, I mean, as a plot device, and the fact that this film was 90 minutes, I think it did a good job. And we did get more later on when he ended up getting sentenced at that labor camp. Right. I think that was some of the more powerful stuff. I kind of wish that we had a little bit more in addition to the montage, but I didn't hate it. I didn't find myself saying, oh, what the heck is this? And I'm a little picky. It's a big ask. I just wish there were a little bit more.
No, I totally understand where you're coming from. I wanted more myself, and I think that's part of a symptom of filmmaking today, is that our generation and the way that directors have been going forward, especially with, big blockbusters and things like that. And I mean, actually kind of thinking about it now, I mean, 2001 was such a watershed moment for franchises, whether you have Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, where you're learning everything about these things. And I think that, these production companies want to have the immersive type of experience within the films, and they're trying to have it where it's like, oh, every little thing about every little character, even minor characters, things in the background. I mean, you can even make an argument for, going back to 1977 with Star Wars and how that whole big boom about knowing everything about everything within the films. But I think that with this, comparing our experiences with film to Preston Sturges' experiences with film are completely different, because he grew up in a time where film was, this is the first kind of growing up phase, the adolescent phase, or, really the teenage years of filmmaking, where he's seeing montage as a way of explaining story, explaining what's happening, explaining, big kind of movements within a film. Because back then it's silent film for like an accompanist playing music with the film, but you also have montage being used because it's just pure cinema. That's what cinema is. It's you're able to show emotion, you're able to show feeling through what's on the screen, and that's it. And I think a lot of that you do definitely derive that from what he's saying within the film and what is going on within those experiences that they're going through when it is that montage period. But I also agree with you because I felt like, well, I feel like the movie is way too short. I felt like there were so many things that we can go into, and like I said, it's probably a symptom of what we've been watching recently and how we've grown up with that montage as a tool for moving a thing forward, like elapsing time. But I think, again, it is really cool to see how he is. And when you know about 1920s and 1930 films, silent films, you're able to see the different angles and you're able to see the things that he took away from those things. And I keep saying on this podcast, we stand on the shoulders of giants. That's what we really do. And I think a lot of the stuff that he was influenced by are clearly in this, and people that are influenced by him and are obviously, using the same things. And we just keep, like you said, history repeats itself. What did you feel about the part where Sullivan finds out that he is dead and the consequences of his death? Like, what do you see within how he's the response of where he's finally found and the consequences or lack thereof?
Well, I thought it was super clever that the way his whole death happened, and how he I think it kind of emphasized the fact that would he have died if he had stayed home, quote unquote died, if he had stayed home and just enjoyed his cushy life? No. The person who died was someone who was living like that, living on the train tracks every day of their life. And it was him putting himself in this situation that had led to what everyone thought was his death. It was a dangerous thing that he did. And I think that I think a lot of people, let's look at COVID now even, a lot of forget how deadly it is or how scary it is until someone close to them is suffering from it. It's, the whole not me, it's not too close to me kind of mentality. And I think that this whole thing emphasized that there are people who are getting run over by trains every day. You don't see them getting printed in a newspaper. We don't even know that guy's name who died. So I think that was an interesting thing, that it only mattered because he was some famous guy.
Right. And even with that, when Sturges is saying, like, hey, look at all these famous people that they do terrible things, because he did hit that guy with a rock in the face. Like, he was trying to kill him.
Oh, yeah. He deserved to get in trouble for that.
Yeah, and it's commentary like, wait, they did something completely wrong, but yet they're going to go off scot-free. And it's like, even back then, like, I mean, where people were, things were covered up. If you look at like Hail Caesar and sources from the actual period itself, where we understand that there were people that were fixers, and it's kind of crazy, like how he was just like, no, like that's wrong. Like, why do we put these people on a pedestal to say, oh no, you're a big celebrity, you're a great person, and all this other stuff, when they're really not, and they're just gonna get away with everything that they do.
Yeah, and he even said, I think Sullivan said something like, movie directors don't get 6 years of this.
Yeah.
Or I wouldn't be sent here as a movie director. So you're kind of right. It points out that these people got away with something, and he did something wrong. That is kind of one thing about the movie that I didn't like, is how fast he remembered who he was. I wish that we got a little bit more, because I think that would have satisfied some of the Gulliver's Travels thing, part of it for me. I think, like I had mentioned earlier, in Gulliver's Travels, he thinks that he's now this super race of human. He thinks he's too good for other people. I think it would have been a very interesting twist if he thought he was lesser than, if he considered himself, I'm just some poor guy who doesn't know his name, who hit someone with a rock and now is doing 6 years. And I think that that would have been a lot more satisfying for me personally. But I thought the way he got out of the situation was very clever. That, then he kind of mentioned, famous people get in the paper just for existing or for dying.
Right.
That poor guy who got, he was stealing money, but, circumstances, I can kind of forgive him a little bit, I think. Yeah, he didn't get put in the paper because he died or anything like that. The only time that the poor destitute get put in the paper is if they're murderers.
Right.
Or if they hurt someone who's famous.
Right.
So he got put in the paper because he said he killed some famous movie director.
A lot of the things at the time, so when we're talking about historical context, Sturges actually said he wrote the film because he wanted to make a reaction to the preaching, quote unquote, he found in other comedy films that were being released at the time, like Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and a couple others. There are still arguments today about films being too political or not political enough. Why do you think that we are discussing that topic today? Is it because people don't want to be confronted by the hard truths that we're talking about while watching films? Like you kind of said that before with film critics in this film, and even with the Modest Proposal, and how that whole context of Malthusian principles and the whole ideas at the time. Do you think it's because of the hard truth, or do you think that people just assume films are supposed to be for entertainment?
I think it's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. I think that it really depends. There's certainly people out there, I think, that would definitely rather sit down and watch a Marvel film rather than watch a film. And there's nothing wrong with this. Some people who want to sit down, watch a superhero movie and escape. And then some people who want to watch something and really feel challenged. And, first movie that comes to mind that might fit the bill is Parasite, maybe because that's the film I saw. And I think that each type of, if we're just grouping the American audience into two different groups, those who want politics in their movies and those that don't. I think, and again, Marvel has politics in it too. That's not to say it doesn't, but I think that, looking at it on the surface, it's definitely a little less politically driven than something like Parasite. But I think it can be problematic on both ends of the spectrum. One being, I just want to completely forget and ignore. I don't want to be part of the discussion. The discourse is not something I want to engage in. While the other side kind of can get into the sticky situation we see in this film with finding the issues glamorous and using the bad stuff as entertainment. Kind of hard to find, I think, a happy medium with that. And it's important to have a little bit of both. That some movies are made just to entertain, and that's okay. Because as seen in this movie, sometimes you just want to sit down and watch something about Pluto and laugh and forget about it. But there needs to be art that does engage people in discourse and engages them in the conversations that are uncomfortable and no one wants to have. And I think now more than ever, with social media, it's easier than ever to have those kinds of conversations. And that's something to be thankful for. But sometimes you do want to just shut your phone off and not engage.
It is that balance. And I think that's one thing that even Sturges wanted to do, because he was a big follower of Brander Matthews, who was an American author that was friends with Mark Twain, Teddy Roosevelt, all these other guys, that said an author should show conditions, but should let the audience draw on their own conclusions. As a writer yourself, do you agree with Matthews and Sturges on this?
100%. And I mean, the fact that Mark Twain's name was mentioned here brings me so much joy, because I think a lot of his works really highlights kind of what this whole film was trying to get at. Is his books were funny. They made people laugh, but they still showed part of the human condition that was a little bit different than maybe the richest of the rich experienced. And it still talks about some of the issues that were prevalent. That's the whole point of satire, right? Is to poke fun at society while also being funny and hilarious. So I definitely agree. I think that the things that are made for entertainment will always have something in there that makes a point. The fact that I thought the very first note I wrote about this movie was LOL because I thought it was so funny. And I didn't feel like I was forced into having a conversation I wasn't okay to have at that time. I didn't feel like anything was being shoved down my throat. I think that had I not been taking notes because we were going to talk about this, I think I would have been like, oh, this is just a really good, funny movie.
Yeah.
So I think movies like this or art like this really fulfills the two important roles and hits on both audiences, entertainment and politics. And I think that when we intertwine them, you get something really powerful.
Yeah, you definitely do. And I feel like that's I mean, you basically just described my theory about what makes a great film great is that it's able to, understand the full scope of humanity without even saying it. Like you said, shoving it down your throat. Where, I mean, again, I know I'm going to bring it up. Sorry. It's a Wonderful Life. It does the same exact thing, and this film does it too. And it's really great to see that we are able to understand that without knowing all of the context, all of the historical type of, my mom like asked, like, because she watched it with me, she was like, oh, who's Lubitsch? Like, people don't need to know who Lubitsch was. They understand who Harvey Weinstein was when you were talking about how the girl was talking about, oh, if you were a director, I'd be fawning all over you and all these other things. And it's actually funnier, even on top of that, when you look at the research, that Lubitsch was a great friend of Preston Sturges. So like it's kind of like the whole commentary on like this is what Hollywood is, and this is, I'm poking fun at my friend, but it is able to bridge that gap where it's, hey, we're on the border of it's hilarious, it's very endearing, it's very, hometown feel to a certain degree, but it's also saying something about our society and how we can change and how we can do things for the better without, like how The Great Dictator, while it is a great film, it's Charlie Chaplin's. I mean, I'm sure like people see this all the time on Instagram or on social media, anywhere where people say it's the greatest speech ever. And it's how like it's Charlie Chaplin, with the toothbrush mustache and, a Hitler type of Nazi uniform making a great speech, and how we need to be more human to each other, how we need to care and love more. While that is a great, great sentiment and that is a great thing, on the other side, Sturgis is saying, hey, make your own opinion about this. This is your choice to make an opinion about politics or about what our society is doing today. It's not saying, hey, this is the right or the wrong, which is why I think a lot of people think that on certain sides, they're like, oh, Hollywood's too much. They're trying to push, a certain agenda, when it depends on the person that's writing or directing or acting in the film. It's not a specific agenda across the board. It is something that is able to bridge the gap for everybody, where everybody understands this, or they might not, or they might. This is a great movie, like you said. I thought it was just like, even without this stuff, I would have loved this movie because it's so funny and the writing is so quick and snappy. And I think that's something that we can still see today, where comedies that are really very good, that are considered to be very good, they're very quick-witted, snappy, back and forth type of situation where there's banter now, where this movie's kind of a little bit ahead of its time. And I mean, Sturgis was massively ahead of his time because he said that TV was the future, that TV is basically going to be the films of the future. And he, while not paraded around as these great, great directors and as a great filmmaker, he definitely makes a major impact on Hollywood.
I agree 100%. Like you said, he includes both aspects that I think make art good without being too heavy-handed, I think, on either of them. The times that weren't necessarily supposed to be too funny were not too funny. Like it didn't go overboard, but also the parts that weren't supposed to be too political weren't too political, and I didn't think the message was contrived. Because I could probably have watched the film thinking it was just your run-of-the-mill comedy and not really look for the politics.
Right.
I probably wouldn't have felt overwhelmed by politics, which I think is important. The people going and watching a movie, it's not one type of person. The people who are going to eventually see it, it's writing for them and knowing what's going to be appropriate at what times. And it's a tricky balance, and that could be potentially why the film was poorly received by its contemporaries. And now that none of us were the people getting criticized at the time, we can completely detach from it in that way. We're not being criticized, so it's a lot easier, I think, to appreciate it.
You're exactly right. He was writing to the masses. And I mean, all the world's a stage, right? The play is the thing. And a lot of the things that Sturges does is exactly that. He understands that there's actually a quote, no matter what the medium is, it's the theater that brings riches to the poor, laughter to the sad, and music, consolation, adventure, romance, the unattainable. But overall, Aubrey, why do you think millennials should... overall, why do you think millennials and the younger generation should watch Sullivan's Travels?
I think Sullivan's Travels is an example of what a good movie is today. Mm-hmm. Kind of what we were talking about. It strikes a balance between political commentary and fun humor. I mean, the dedication itself, I read something like, to the memory of those who made us laugh, this picture is affectionately dedicated, with some stuff in the middle too, whose efforts have lightened our burden a little. This, I think, does a good job of lightening the burden while also giving you stuff to talk about. I think if this movie just was funny, we wouldn't be able to sit here for however long we've been talking and just talk about it. I think it's clever, it's funny, the characters are great, and it really speaks to how satire works today. And I think that it would be very easy for anyone, if never watched an old movie, I think this would be a really good one to start with.
I really hope you enjoyed today's discussion I had with Aubrey about Preston Sturges' satirical classic, Sullivan's Travels. I really like to thank her for taking the time out of her day to come on the show and to bring a lot of great literary insights and influences on the film and its writing. If you enjoyed this episode of Cinemallennials and want to watch the film we discussed, please check out my website, dlumoviereview.com, for more episodes of the podcast, film reviews, analyses, and where to purchase the film we discussed today. Please don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and give us a rating, as it helps more people find the podcast. Thank you.